Hey, so it's time for me to resurrect a video series I did back at the end of 2024. You know me, I love my 90s hip-hop, and if you're watching this video, it's likely that you do too. Back at the end of 2024, I curated a list of 20 underrated 90s hip-hop albums, and I counted them down over two separate videos. After thinking about it recently, I said to myself, there's a ton of albums that I had in the pipeline that didn't make the cut on any of those two videos. Why not make a part 3? So here I am, this is the third episode in the video series. Of course, there's been a bit of a hiatus, but we're picking it back up now, and I have at least 2 or 3 more videos coming. But for this video, I'm going to list yet another 10 90s hip-hop albums that I think are underrated, they don't get enough attention, and I'm going to count them down in order from what I think is the least obscure to the most obscure. I'm not going to tie this list in with future episodes of the video series, I'm just going to pick 10 now and count them down, and the next episode we'll have another 10 that will be counted down from least obscure to most obscure. Some of these albums I think live in the shadow of other albums by an artist, and some are just generally slept on. Let's start it off. Number 10 is an album that I think a lot of hip-hop heads are at least aware of. I think this is a little slept on because it's a dense concept album and there's a lot going on, a lot to unpack. The album is Prince Paul's Ambitious: A Prince Among Thieves from 1999. This is a 77-minute, 35-track record that follows the story of an up-and-coming rapper who needs money to get his foot in the door in the industry. As such, he needs quick money, so he turns to violence and drug dealing before facing a tragic ending. The main character is played by the Juggernaut's Breezy Bruin, who I think has one of the best flows from that entire era. While Breezy is the main voice and Prince Paul does all the beats on this thing, there are some very high-profile guest appearances here. Names like Big Daddy Kane, Kool Keith, Everlast, De La Soul, Chubb Rock, and a few others really help fill out the story and develop the narrative. There are even a number of skits on here that play sort of like a radio drama and help bolster the story even further. A Prince Among Thieves is basically hip-hop's version of a rock opera. Prince Paul has forever been one of the most creative and ambitious minds in the game, and he puts his concept into motion here, while also making a critical observation of what was going on in the inner city, and how if you weren't able to get out of it, you kind of had to turn to drugs or crime to be successful. And ironically, the main character is trying to get out of this treacherous game and get into the rap game and have sort of a legitimate hustle. I think overall many deep hip-hop fans have grown to love this thing as the years have gone by, but it still feels to me like an album that doesn't get enough of the spotlight. This is one of the most excellent hip-hop albums from the year 1999. It's an excellent conceptual album that should be heard by any fan of deeper, more cerebral hip-hop. At number 9, I think it's time to touch on what I think is the finest 90s record from Masta Ace. By 1993, which was 3 years removed from his debut album Take a Look Around, Masta Ace now had a crew called Masta Ace Incorporated, and they dropped their debut album Slaughterhouse that year. The first of 2 albums under the Masta Ace Incorporated name, this album has definitely gained some traction in recent years, though I still think overall it flies under the radar. The unique thing about Slaughterhouse is it actually features a ton of parody and satire, as Masta Ace uses this record to mock the emerging hardcore violent trends that actually made mid-90s New York hip-hop pretty enjoyable for me and for many. He uses this form of jest to make kind of an indirect commentary on how the tough guy, violent nature of much of what was coming out of New York by the mid-90s, maybe it wasn't necessary. In the process, Ace and his crew drop some absolute heat as they kind of find a way to do this formula even better than the guys who were doing it seriously, which is wild. And look, some of the beats on here are just excellent. A lot of the lyrics, you can tell Masta Ace was poking fun, but the beats, man, the production here is insane, and a lot of it is done by Masta Ace himself under the name Ace One. The whole album features speaker-rattling bass and hardcore drums that were actually among some of the best beats you would hear in 1993. They were dusty, they were a little bit lo-fi, but they just had some insane sample flips. The soundscapes on Late Model Sedan, Rollin' with Umdada, and Crazy Drunken Style are just some of my favorites from the entire era. And on top of this, Ace gives the listener something to think about, that is, if the listener can understand that a lot of what's being said here by Ace and the MCs and his crew was in jest. Now, Masta Ace has always been one of the most forward-thinking minds in hip-hop. He emerged as part of the Juice Crew in the Golden Age and instantly set himself as one of the best MCs in that whole collective. And there were a lot of spitters in that crew, including Big Daddy Kane, Kool G Rap, and Craig G. 1990s Take a Look Around, it was a conscious hip-hop masterpiece. And then here in 93, Ace and his crew emerged with a masterclass in mockery. Think about how this fits into Ace's catalog, especially with those first 2 albums from the 2000s, which were these ambitious concepts. And this is just a reminder that Ace's discography is one of the most diverse and unique catalogs out there. Way back in the first part of this series, I named Scarface's The Diary as one of the more underrated 90s hip-hop albums. It's arguable how underrated underrated that really is. I kind of put a couple picks on there that were a little controversial just to spark a little bit of discussion. Hint, hint, I do that sometimes. But there's another earlier album from the Houston rapper that I do think is distinctly underrated, and it's his debut, 1991's Mr. Scarface Is Back. So the first two albums on this list I covered by Masta Ace and Prince Paul, they sort of had a commentary on what was going on in the inner city, even though the commentary was in kind of two very different formats. Mr. Scarface Is Back, which is the earliest of all the albums on this list, predating everything, is a stark reality of Scarface's view on the dark, swampy, violent streets of Houston. He was always known as a vulgar, stark, nihilistic rapper who pulled no punches, and this was his format in the Ghetto Boys in the years leading up to this album. He doubles down on this formula on his debut, and it's kind of a form of street-level journalism that is not exactly conscious or making a commentary other than this is what he was seeing and this was his reality. And even though the subject matter is mostly menacing, he does make some stark observations of what was going on around him, and they should be taken seriously, as this was unfortunately the way things were in the inner city in the 90s, following the crack epidemic and the decimation of inner cities at the time. He does do this with a bit of an over-the-top approach. You can tell that some of these things are exaggerated, and there is kind of a slice of humor that's put in here. Beats are funky, they're menacing, and much of it was handled by Scarface himself alongside another producer known as Crazy C. Standouts include the lead singles Mr. Scarface and A Minute to Pray and A Second to Die, and one of my personal favorites on the album is Your Ass Got Took. While the lyrics are vulgar, they do show him kind of emerging as the South's leading storyteller at the time. He was Houston's version of Kool G rapper even Slick Rick. What Scarface and the Ghetto Boys were doing in the late 80s and early 90s was showing that the South had something to say, for lack of a better term, showing that Houston was to be respected. And what was coming out of the Houston area during that time was by far the most influential regional scene outside of the East or West coasts. Scarface helped lead the charge for Houston into the 90s with this, his Ruthless debut record. Number 7 is one that comes from one of the most legendary 90s crews out of the Bronx. That's the DITC or Diggin' in the Crates crew. Lord Finesse was one of DITC's main creative forces among a crew that featured names like Diamond D, Big L, Fat Joe, Showbiz and AG, and OC. Finesse had two quality albums in the early 90s, but I think his best work comes on his third record, 1996's The Awakening. Like many DITC-facing albums, most of the crew members make guest appearances throughout. Lord Finesse leads this lyrical charge with witty, punchline-driven bars, some of which are so clever that they'll get a laugh from me every now and then. Finesse was one of the earlier examples of a rapper-producer. He does all the beats on here and contributes about half of the rhymes, and all of the beats are extremely excellent. Take the chilled out, sample-heavy Speak Your Piece, which I think is one of the best rap deep cuts of the 90s. The vibe on this track is just pure 90s New York, gritty, rough, rugged, and raw, and it's one of my favorite cuts off this album. There's a ton of other lovable moments here like Hip to the Game and True and Livin', and also the excellent closer, the tentative, ominous, Actual Facts, which brings in 2/3 of Brand Nubian as well as Large Professor. The guest appearances outside of DITC are also excellent, with KRS-One appearing on 2 tracks, while MC Lyte, Akinelli, and Kid Capri also show up. Let's admit, there's not a ton of substance to the lyrics on this album. Finesse was a clever rapper, but he really didn't have too much to say. But aesthetically, I think there are a few producers that could really catch that mid-90s New York grittiness the way that Finesse could. His patented trademark drums, his booming bass lines, and that use of jingle bells, which complement the treble to each of these tracks, are just such an effective formula. Even Diamond D and Buckwild, who were the two other in-house producers for DITC, couldn't quite compete on Finesse's level when it came to the boards. And I will say those two guys are two of the most underrated 90s producers of all time. This is kind of a hot take if you know DITC's output from the 90s, but I think this is the best DITC album from the 90s. A lot of people would give that to Big L's Lifestyles of the Poor and Dangerous, or Showbiz and AG's Runaway Slave, or even Diamond D's Stunts, Blunts, and Hip Hop. And that's why I think that The Awakening is quite a bit underrated. It lives in the shadow of these other albums from the crew, and honestly, it shouldn't. The only one of those that really does stand up against it is Big L's album, which is admittedly probably better. But I like the beats on The Awakening better. This is an excellent record. 1997 was a year where underground hip-hop really started to emerge at first on the East Coast, but then spreading to other cities and regional scenes. One of the first non-East Coast acts to kind of exhibit this backpacker underground style was Cincinnati's Mood. Their album Doom is number 6 on this list. Coast. There was really no way to tell that these guys weren't from the East Coast, as this album features jazzy instrumentals, hard, crisp drums, and a good amount of breaks and scratching. Mood was a three-piece group consisting of rappers Main Flow and Dante and producer Jason. While Dante is a solid rapper, Main Flow is the most prominent lyricist in the crew, and he was quickly establishing himself as one of the Midwest's main wordsmiths during this time. While Jason provides about half the beats on this album, the other half are done by High Tech, another Cincinnati native. High Tech is now known as one of the most heralded underground producers, and he got his career started with Mood. In my eyes, the best production on this album comes from High Tech, in particular the beats Info for the Streets and the excellent Karma, which is one of the best piano sample flips I've ever heard. That piano and vocal sample is a great backdrop for Main Flow and Dante to spit darts over, and again, it's one of my favorite instrumentals of all time. Mood's debut album is also well known for being one of the first recorded appearances of Talib Kweli, a Brooklyn rapper who went on to explode in the years to come. Talib Kweli appears on 3 tracks here, and this was around the same time that he was showing up on the first Sound Bombing compilation. But his work on Doom with High Tech kicked off a collaborative relationship between the two, and the two would go on to form Reflection Eternal. This led to the release of the album Train of Thought in the year 2000, which is one of the most heralded underground albums of that year. And their start as a collaborative duo can be traced right back to this album, which is a solid, slept-on record aside from the High Tech and Talib Kweli collaboration. This one definitely deserves more attention. One of the names that's thrown around as one of the most underappreciated rappers of the 90s is that of San Francisco's Paris. He broke out in 1990 with a politically driven masterpiece, his debut, The Devil Made Me Do It. Deep hip-hop heads know that his entire 90s catalog is solid, but for me, I think his second album, Sleeping with the Enemy, is just as solid as his debut and sometimes lives in the shadow of it, and it shouldn't. This makes it the number 5 album on my list. On Sleeping with the Enemy, Paris doubles down on the energy from his debut and probably gets a little bit more into his zone, and that's delivering stark political statements that frankly upset white America. This was not uncommon from the West Coast at that time, as Ice Cube was doing more of the same. Paris's second album shows him literally and figuratively putting a sitting president in the crosshairs with the borderline shocking song Bush Killer. Coffee, Donuts, and Death is a stark anti-cop song, and there are many songs dedicated to the empowerment and rallying of African Americans, including the opener, The Furious Make Way for a Panther. There may be a little bit more of a subtle nod to the movement on Assata's song, which could be referring to Black Liberation Army leader Assata Shakur, though the song just appears to uplift African American women in general. Compared to the noise that Ice Cube made as a solo artist after his NWA days, using that same aggressive political approach, Paris kind of got stuck a little bit in obscurity. Of course, Cube had made a name for himself with NWA before going solo. Of course, Paris's first album in 1990, that's basically where he got started. But his work has gone on to achieve a cult following and some of the most important political hip-hop of all time. He represented Northern California with a distinct DIY approach to his lyrics and beats, most of the beats he did on his own, and that goes not just for Sleeping with the Enemy, but also on The Devil Made Me Do It. Sleeping with the Enemy is often overlooked in favor of The Devil Made Me Do It, but I think his second album is just as important as his first, and it should be regarded as such. Staying on the West Coast for number 4, I want to turn to one of the most important early G-Funk groups, and that's Pomona, California's Above the Law. They came out in 1990 with their debut Living Like Hustlers, which was produced by Dr. Dre and featured some of the earliest G-Funk styles on record. While 1993's Black Mafia Life was a celebrated follow-up to their debut, it's 1994's Uncle Sam's Curse that I think is a better album and often gets overlooked in favor of their first two. Black Mafia Life was this hour and 10-minute winding record that didn't have too much of a purpose, it seemed, but Above the Law figured out kind of a direction they wanted to go in on Uncle Sam's Curse. They were actually down a member by this time, as Go Mac had left the group in 1993. They took the dark G-Funk production that was exhibited by group member and producer Cold 187, and 187 and KMG take a bit more of a conscious and political stance here with their lyrics. Right off the bat, Black Superman is the standout song here. Over an excellent beat, both MCs speak to the dangerous conditions that black men had to deal with in the inner city and coming up, and how important it was to lean on family. The title track speaks to the systemic racism and discrimination that was often put forth by the US government, much of which seemed motivated by the tumultuous societal conditions in the group's home of Southern California at that time. Gangsta Madness is a stunning, morose closer. Who Ride features an appearance from Tone Loc and underground rapper Cocaine, and the song California brings cocaine back for a strong ode to the West Coast. Uncle Sam's Curse is a great mixture of G-Funk, conscious hip-hop, and just overall laid-back, well-calculated West Coast hip-hop. Above the Law had kind of matured as a group by this time. They'd chilled out a little bit, and it's very obvious that they had sort of changed their tone, and it makes their third album absolutely excellent. In fact, I think this almost rivals Livin' Like Hustlers in quality. This will honestly forever live in the shadow of that album, but it just adds to my case as to why Uncle Sam's Curse is underrated and comes in at number 4 on this list for me. For number 3, it's back to the East Coast, and I think this is one of the most slept on 90s East Coast hip-hop albums. I think Sadat X's 1996 debut Wild Cowboys is fantastic and underrated. The East Coast hip-hop landscape was looking far different in 1996 than it did when Brand Nubian came out in the beginning of the decade. Sadat X navigates it perfectly on Wild Cowboys, further employing his unorthodox delivery and lyrical cadence in his iconic high-pitched nasal voice. I will admit that this album is carried just as much by Sadat X as it is by the guest producers and artists. There are some juicy mid-90s beats from names like Buck Wild, The Beat Miners, Diamond D, DJ Alamo, Showbiz, Pete Rock, and Dante Ross. I mean, phew, what a collection of producers. Guest appearances include Brand Nubian's Grand Poobah on the excellent Loungy Open Bar, as well as underground rappers like Sean Black and Lord Tariq with his group The Money Boss Players. Sauce for Birdheads is just a weirdo left field cut that I love. The opener, The Lump Lump, samples some country and western song, and the hash out is a hardcore closer that wraps up this album perfectly. Sadat X Wild Cowboys. Listen to this one if you haven't listened to it already. It's extremely overlooked and underrated. It's a gem that came out late in New York City's mid-90s hip-hop renaissance. I just did a video series on New York City's hip-hop renaissance. Check that out. I'll link that above. For now, I'll say that Wild Cowboys is incredibly overlooked, and it easily makes my top 3 most underrated 90s albums for this episode. Moving down from New York to Philadelphia for number 2, I want to highlight one of the most slept-on rappers in the game from the mid-90s, somebody who I think doesn't get nearly enough attention, and that's Bahamadia. She's one of the most technically skilled rappers to ever come out of Philadelphia during that mid-90s East Coast explosion. Her 1996 debut Collage is an excellent album, and it's my number 2 most underrated 90s hip-hop album on this list. Bahamadia broke out in 1994 with the single Total Wreck, which was produced by Gang Starr's Guru. She had somehow fallen in with Guru and Premier on the jazz rap circuit in the early to mid-90s and ended up signing a deal with Gang Starr's label, Chrysalis Records. While appearing on other tracks such as with Philadelphia's The Roots, as well as the second installment of Guru's Jazzmatazz series in 1995, she put together Collage, which dropped in early 1996. The album was a clinic in mid-90s jazzy boom bap, with excellent production across the board from DJ Premier, The Roots, Ski Beats, N.O. Joe, and a few others. The album's lead single is You Know How We Do, which saw some modest success on the East Coast. Other songs like the Premier-produced Rugged Rough and 3 The Hard Way utilized hardcore beats, while the aforementioned single Total Wreck did make the album despite being recorded 2 years earlier. In my last video, I did a deep dive on 90s Philadelphia hip-hop, and I named this one of my top 5 albums from that regional scene during that time. Check out the video linked here for more. Bahamadia boasted an excellent, syncopated, unique, but laid-back flow over an excellent collection of beats here on Collage. I'm not sure why Collage is not more celebrated in mid-90s hip-hop canon. Maybe it's because she was from a smaller city, maybe it's because of her gender, we'll never know. Regardless, this album should never be slept on. Collage is incredibly overlooked, and it should never be overlooked. It easily makes this list a number 2. Do you like what you're seeing? Do you want more? No, that's not the number 1 album, but if you do want more, please like and subscribe to the channel just to be alerted for when I drop new content. And with that, we have reached the end of the list. It's time for number 1. For this episode, this is not the most underrated 90s hip-hop album ever in my opinion, but for this episode, this is at the top of the list, and this is an album that I really feel needs to be celebrated. This top pick comes from an MC who has a huge cult following, and most of that is based off of his debut album. Unfortunately, in late 2024, we lost Bay Area legend Saafir, but his 1994 debut Boxcar Sessions really helps his memory live on, and I think is one of the most overlooked hip-hop albums of all time, 90s or otherwise. And for now, it gets the top spot on this list, on this 3rd episode of underrated 90s hip-hop albums. Saafir entered the scene in the early 90s alongside none other than Tupac. Both were dancers in the Digital Underground crew in the early 90s, and Tupac and Saafir were actually roommates for a period of time. After making his recording debut with Digital Underground in 1993, he released Boxcar Sessions in the second half of 1994. Already known for his extremely unorthodox stream of consciousness flow delivered in such a gruff and unique voice, Saafir proved on Boxcar Sessions that he could definitely carry a full album. The lead single here is Light Sleeper, which remains one of the most important Bay Area underground hip-hop cuts of the 90s. The beat is jazzy, introspective, and supports Saafir's unpolished, ultra-unique flow as he spits a myriad of bars that are both dense and abstract. This cryptic approach was used across the board on Boxcar Sessions. There are a lot of great lyrical tracks from Can You Feel Me to Real Circus, and also one of my personal favorites, Swig of the Stew. Saphir definitely makes these references to homelessness and living in train cars, while I'm not sure that that was actually his reality at the time. He was part of a collective called the Hobo Junction, and a few members of the Hobo Junction do make guest appearances throughout Boxcar Sessions. The beats are also decidedly jazzy and have this rugged boom bap, almost East Coast style. They definitely don't scream mid-90s Bay Area hip-hop. And just a side note, I find that West Coast artists who kind of use that boom bap style a little bit more than the polished, shiny G-Funk style, I think their albums have aged a little bit better, honestly. And Boxcar Sessions is no exception. As I mentioned, Saphir passed away in November 2024. Apparently he had health problems at the end of his life, but his distinct voice, his unorthodox cadence, and some very memorable guest appearances throughout the late 90s and 2000s help his legacy live on. He was kind of a legend that lived in the shade a little bit, but whenever he jumped on a song after Boxcar Sessions, that song was extremely memorable. I remember hearing Exhibit's second album, 40 Days and 40 Nights, around the time that it came out, in particular the song 3 Card Molly, because I was always asking myself, who is this guy with this weirdo, left field, strange, unorthodox delivery and this low, booming, strange voice? And I still listen to that song and I try and figure out what he's talking about, but this weirdo, this left field rapper is one of the most legendary Bay Area rappers of all time, who left us with one of the most legendary, underrated, and undercelebrated albums in Boxcar Sessions. I'm glad this thing has definitely achieved a cult following in recent years, but I think it's one of the more underrated 90s hip-hop albums from the Bay Area, from the West Coast, really from anywhere in the country. Boxcar Sessions tops my list for this episode. So I have more episodes in the pipeline for this series, so if you don't see some of your favorite 90s underrated albums here, they may be coming, or maybe not. You might see them on a later list, but in the meantime, let me know what albums you would consider underrated for the 90s, whether it be from the West Coast, the East Coast, the South, international, wherever. Comment below, let me know what you think of my list and what some of these albums mean to you. Always appreciate your support and engagement. Thank you for tuning in. I'll see you soon.